Good afternoon. I just turned 50 last week. And when I was born, then the yearly demand for material resources at a global level was at about 28 billion tons per year. That is approximately 5 times Mont Blanc. And then by the time I turned 30, then it had doubled already. And now, 20 years later only, it doubled again. So the question is, how will this now continue in future? Will our grandchildren need Mount Everest because the next doubling is in 15 years and then 10 years and then 5 years from now? So where will this lead us? Well, let's take a look at the drivers behind that increase in material demand. There's, of course, the population. The more people, the more materials we will need. Then there's the affluence. That's the wealth. The more money people have, the more they will spend it to buy all kinds of things that need resources. And then finally, there's the resource intensity of our spendings. How many kilograms of material do we need per euro, per dollar that we spend? And obviously, if we spend our money on, for example, buying bricks for building houses, that will be much more resource intensive than if we spend our money in going to the theater, for example. So let us try to understand what the evolutions, the trends are in these drivers. First of all, population growth. Well, actually, there's good news because population is still growing, but the peak of the rate at which population has been growing was already reached in the 1960s, with more than 2% growth rate at that moment. Today, we're below 1%, and the estimates are that by the end of the century, we will be at a zero growth or even a negative growth. So we will reach a maximum in global population. So population will in future not be the main driver behind our resource demand growth. Then what about affluence? What about the wealth? What about the money we can spend per person? There are obviously main differences. If you look around the globe, there are fluctuations throughout time. There's a lot of inequality, but nevertheless, if you zoom out and you look at the global average evolution, then you see that over the last century, we have been seeing a steady increase in the affluence with about 1.5 to 2% per year. And that has resulted also in quite nice results. I mean, if you look at global poverty, for example, the share of people living in extreme poverty 2 centuries ago was at a mind-boggling 90% of population. Today, we're down to 10%. And obviously, if we look into the future, we still need a further increase in wealth, especially in the global south, in order to make sure that everyone has a decent standard of living. So we can expect a further increase over there. And then the resource intensity of the economy. What you see on this graph is a lot of different countries. Every circle represents a country, and the larger the circle, the larger the population in that country. And every color represents a continent. And for each of these countries, you see the material demand per person, and you see the money per person, the GDP per person. And actually, there's something very interesting on this graph, because you see that there is some kind of a trend line that, with all kinds of variations, of course, between individual countries, but there is a kind of a trend line that you can observe there. And what is even more interesting is that if you look at historic evolutions for countries, then these countries, irrespective of where they are in the world, what cultures they have, and so forth, they seem to be following that similar curve. So let's try to analyze a little bit this curve. You see on the left-hand side, you see that there are countries where the increase in resource demand, in material footprint, seems to go faster than the economic growth. In fact, we can understand that, because if you look at this photo of Shanghai, and then 25 later, the same photo, then you see how that city, that country, went through an evolution that was very resource intensive. They were building a lot of infrastructure, a lot of roads, a lot of buildings, a lot of bridges, and of course you need a whole lot of material to realize that. But if you then look at the countries that are more on the right-hand side of the graph, then you see that you find there countries where a large part of the economic growth is related to growth of the service economy that is much less resource intensive. And the good news is that quite some countries with large populations have been evolving over time already through that resource intensive phase and start to get into the less resource intensive phase of the industrial development. So in fact, if you take all of these trends together, you can try to make a prediction of where we will be going, and like the OECD has done so, and their estimate is that the next doubling will not be in 15 or 10 years from now, but rather in 40 years from now. So there will still be a lot of growth in resource demand, but it's not going to be faster and faster and faster. Now, nevertheless, you can still ask yourself, what are the challenges ahead of us? Will the next doubling, will that lead us into troubles? Will we maybe not have enough material? Will we run out of materials? Well, the good thing is physical depletion of our resources, that will not be our main issue in the coming decades. We will not just run out of materials. The world has enough materials to cover the needs of the entire population. You can paraphrase a well-known saying, the Stone Age didn't end because of lack of stones. Of course, there will be some challenges. There are challenges related to the fact that the ore grade might be declining. There will be challenges related to the economics of mining, but the physical depletion of resources will not be the main issues. Where do I see the main issues? It's at the interconnection of global resource demand and climate change, because these two are very heavily connected. First of all, because the material management is responsible for about 50% of our greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. 50% is related to our resource use. And of these 50%, almost half of that is due to steel sector, cement sector for making concrete. In fact, all these materials that we need in those very resource intensive phases of industrial development. If you look, for example, at the steel sector, you can do some carbon budgeting. You all know about the Paris Agreement and about the carbon budget that we still have in order to stay below the 1.5 degrees that we are targeting. And that carbon budget, you can distribute it, allocate it to different sectors. And if you then look at the part that you could allocate to the steel sector, it's well possible, if we continue business as usual, that within the next 10 years, we will already have consumed that entire carbon budget in that sector. Does that mean that there are no solutions? Yes, there are technological solutions. There are a lot of technological developments, for example, to create carbon neutral steel using hydrogen, even green hydrogen, but there's still a lot of developments to be done there. Hence, we have to speed up the green hydrogen economy. We have to speed up that development from the pilot scale steel making to the really industrial scale. We have to make sure that all that knowledge is also available in the global south, where that increase in steel needs for infrastructural development will be needed in future. So there's a lot of things to be done there that we need to speed up. Now, there's a second link between climate change and resource demand. Resource demand is not only driving climate change, but the strategies to combat climate change are also driving resource demand. If I talk about doubling of our resource demand, this is an average. There are certain materials that are connected to our transition to more renewable energy, the entire energy transition that we need in order to combat climate change. And the growth in demand for these materials will go much faster than the doubling I was just talking about. We talk about, for example, a 20-fold increase in lithium demand in only 30 years from now. The same holds true for some rare earth materials, the same holds true for cobalt, and so forth and so forth. So there's huge challenges related to the resource demand coupled to climate change now, or the energy transition. Now, an issue that is still making it more challenges relates to where we find these materials. It's what we call critical raw materials. There are a number of materials for which the supply today is very much concentrated in certain countries over the world. For example, the cobalt, 60% of the cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. The rare earth materials, most of them, they come from China. Lithium, a lot of it comes from Chile. Palladium, a lot of it comes from Russia. So this entire evolution in resource demand and its connection to climate change and the energy transition is also very much coupled to geopolitics. So, shall we try to reduce our material demand? Obviously, we have to. What can you do? In fact, the solutions have been known for a very long time. Reduce, reuse, recycle. Not for the fear of getting out of materials, of not having enough materials, but for world peace and for combating climate change. Thank you.